The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and a chilling wind swept across the arid landscape of the Navajo Nation. Jake, a seasoned hiker and photographer, stood at the edge of a trail, peering into the deepening shadows of the desert. His friends had warned him against venturing alone too far into these lands, but the idea of capturing untouched landscapes had always appealed to him more than the rumors of ancient legends. He chuckled to himself, adjusting his pack, dismissing the warnings as mere superstition. The Navajo had always spoken in hushed tones about the Skinwalkers, the shape-shifting witches of legend who roamed the desert at night, using the skins of animals to take on their forms. But Jake wasn't one to give in to ghost stories. After all, he had hiked through many haunted places, and nothing had ever happened to him. But tonight, as the wind howled through the canyons and the full moon illuminated the land, something felt off. Jake paused at the edge of the trail. His flashlight flickered for a brief moment, casting eerie shadows on the desert floor. He took a deep breath and continued forward, shrugging off the feeling of unease. But the further he walked, the heavier the air seemed to become. It wasn't just the wind, but a suffocating presence, one that gnawed at the back of his mind and whispered to him. Probably just the isolation, Jake muttered, trying to shake off the sensation. He quickened his pace, eager to reach his destination. And then, he heard it. A faint rustling noise, not from the wind or the bushes, but from something, or someone, moving through the brush. Jake stopped in his tracks. His heart began to race. The noise wasn't random. It was deliberate. A slow, methodical creeping, like footsteps. He spun around, but saw nothing. His flashlight darted across the desert, catching only the occasional rock or scrub brush. Jake laughed nervously to himself. It's just an animal, he reasoned. But the thought did little to ease the growing panic tightening around his chest. The rustling came again, this time much closer. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He spun back to face the direction he was heading, his flashlight swinging wildly. There, at the edge of his beam, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was too tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its skin seemed to shimmer in the light like an oily surface. But the most disturbing feature was its eyes. Wide, dark, and almost devoid of any humanity. The figure stood completely still, watching him. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. He tried to take a step back, but his legs wouldn't move. It wasn't until the figure took a single step forward that Jake snapped into action. His survival instincts kicked in. He spun on his heel and began to run, his heart pounding in his chest. The night air grew thick, and his feet seemed to stumble over invisible obstacles as he ran, desperate to escape. And then, the voice came. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. A guttural sound, like a snarl mixed with the slow drawl of a human voice, filled the air. Run, the voice whispered. Only it wasn't in a language Jake understood. The words rattled through his bones like a shockwave. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed his legs harder, his mind focused only on escape. He dared not look back, but every nerve in his body screamed that it was getting closer. And then, in a burst of terror and adrenaline, his foot caught on a rock. He tumbled forward, his face hitting the hard earth with a sickening crack. His flashlight skidded across the ground, its beam flickering before it went out completely. The world was plunged into darkness. You can't run, the voice whispered again. But this time it was all around him, not just in his ears, but in his mind. You're already mine. A cold, slick hand grasped his ankle, pulling him toward the darkness that seemed to devour him whole. He screamed, but the sound was smothered by the night air as the cold hands dragged him deeper into the abyss. The last thing Jake saw before the darkness overtook him was a pair of glowing eyes staring down at him. The last thing he felt was the crushing weight of something unnatural. And then, nothing. The next morning, Jake's friends searched for him frantically. They combed through the desert, calling his name, but found no sign of him. His pack was located a few miles down the trail, untouched. The only thing that remained were his camera and the strange, warped tracks leading deeper into the wilderness, a trail that seemed to stretch endlessly in the direction of the mountains. The news of Jake's disappearance reached the town of Chinnell, where MIA, Jake's girlfriend, had been waiting anxiously for his return. She'd heard the stories of Skinwalkers, but like Jake, she had dismissed them as superstitions. Now, with no word from him for days, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. MIA enlisted the help of two of Jake's friends, Tyler and Emma, to search for him. Armed with flashlights and backpacks, the trio set out on the trail, unaware of the deadly game they were about to be pulled into. As they neared the area where Jake had last been seen, the temperature seemed to drop. The wind picked up, the familiar desert air now cold and biting. They trudged forward in silence, each of them haunted by the thought of Jake's disappearance. Tyler, usually the skeptic, could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every now and then, he would stop and glance nervously at the trees, at the shadows that seemed to move just outside the edge of their flashlights. "Something's not right," Tyler muttered. "You're just paranoid," Emma said, trying to reassure him. But Mia's silence spoke volumes. She, too, felt the presence, the feeling of being pursued by something dark and ancient. The further they went, the more uneasy they became. They found strange marks on trees, deep gouges that didn't seem to be made by animals. They came across piles of bones arranged in strange patterns, and once, a guttural sound that made them freeze in place. They all heard it, the sound of something not quite human, coming from the thick of the trees. They called out to Jake, but there was no answer. And then, they saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of their sight, watching them with those same glowing eyes. The figure shifted, and they saw the shape of a large wolf, its eyes locked onto them, predatory and calculating. "Move," MIA whispered, her voice tight with fear. They turned and began to run, their hearts racing as the howling followed them, growing louder. The night was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a nightmare. As they reached the clearing near the base of the canyon, they stopped short. The figure was there, this time fully visible, standing tall. It was no longer a wolf, but a man, his features twisted, his body unnaturally long and gaunt. He smiled at them, his teeth sharp like those of a predator. "Welcome," it whispered, "to my hunting ground." MIA, Tyler, and Emma stood frozen in the clearing, their eyes locked on the figure that towered before them. The man, or what looked like a man, was unnaturally tall, his limbs too long, his hands twisted in grotesque, claw-like shapes. His skin was a strange, mottled hue, like the bark of an old tree, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, predatory and filled with an unsettling intelligence. The smile on his face was too wide, and the sharpness of his teeth gleamed in the pale moonlight. "What do you want from us?" MIA gasped, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. She felt a cold sweat trickle down her back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure tilted its head, its lips curling into a grin that seemed to stretch even wider, almost as though it took pleasure in their fear. "You came to my territory," it said, its voice low and gravelly. But there was something unnatural about it, like the voice was both human and animal, layered with a deep, guttural rasp that made Mia's skin crawl. The trio stood motionless, trying to assess whether running was an option, but the figure's presence paralyzed them. It moved closer, its long arms stretching unnaturally as if it were floating above the ground, gliding toward them. MIA could feel the ground beneath her feet tremble with each step the creature took, and the air around her grew thick with a presence that suffocated her. The creature stopped a mere few feet away. Its glowing eyes narrowed, studying them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. Then, it opened its mouth to speak again. "You smell human," it rasped, inhaling deeply, as though savoring their scent. The air shifted as it moved closer. "You've intruded on the land of the Skinwalker." The air around them seemed to grow still, and the temperature plummeted. Every sound, the rustling of the wind, the chirping of nocturnal creatures, seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating silence that hung between them and the creature. Mia's breath caught in her throat. It knew them. The figure in front of them wasn't just any wild thing. It was something far more ancient, something bound to the very earth they stood on. The stories MIA had read about Skinwalkers, those dark, shape-shifting beings who could walk among humans and animals alike, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. Tyler, the skeptic of the group, finally found his voice. "This isn't real. You're just some guy." His words trailed off as the creature shifted, its limbs bending and cracking in unnatural directions. The creature tilted its head once more, then crouched down like an animal about to pounce. It smiled, and in that moment, the transformation was complete. What had been a man mere seconds ago was now something else entirely. A beast, a shapeshifter of the worst kind. Its body twisting and contorting before their eyes into the form of a massive, predatory wolf, its teeth glistening like knives. "Run," it growled. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. MIA screamed as she grabbed Tyler's arm, yanking him toward the trees. Emma wasn't far behind them, her legs pumping furiously as they sprinted through the darkened woods, not daring to look back at the beast that pursued them. Mia's heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, threatening to drown out everything else. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of the creature's heavy breathing grew louder behind them, growing closer and closer with each passing second. Its growl was like a distant thunderclap, and every now and then, MIA thought she could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the earth. "It's gaining on us," Tyler yelled. MIA risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the glow of the creature's eyes shining through the trees. Its form was enormous now, its muscles rippling beneath the thick, matted fur. "We need to get to the car," Emma shouted, her voice hoarse from fear. But the forest seemed endless, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. With every step they took, the path became more treacherous. Rocks jutted out of the ground, tree roots curled up like traps, and their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them stumbling through complete darkness. The creature's growls were now mixed with harsh, guttural laughs, echoing through the trees. Mia's legs burned with the effort of running, but she couldn't stop. She could feel the creature's breath on her neck, could feel the danger closing in around them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin out. The sound of the highway, distant but unmistakable, reached her ears. Her hope surged, but just as they emerged from the trees, the ground beneath them shifted. Tyler screamed as he was knocked off his feet, the creature's claws raking across his leg. MIA and Emma turned to see Tyler lying on the ground, his body twitching, his face pale with pain. Blood pooled around his leg where the creature had struck him. "Tyler!" Emma screamed. MIA rushed to help him, but before she could get to him, the creature lunged. Its enormous form crashed into the dirt with a thunderous impact, its jaws snapping just inches from her face. The sheer force of its attack knocked her backward, sending her sprawling across the cold earth. For a moment, everything went dark. Mia's vision blurred as she struggled to get back to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard Emma's screams, saw the creature towering over them. She could feel the sharp sting of fear cut through her body like an icy blade. But then, something unexpected happened. The beast stopped, its head tilted to the side, and it looked toward the trees, its ears twitching. MIA followed its gaze, her breath catching in her throat as another figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. The creature snarled, backing away from the newcomer. The figure stepped forward, its movements calm, deliberate. "Leave them," it said, its voice low and commanding. The skinwalker growled, its eyes narrowing, but it did not attack. Instead, it let out a final, bone-chilling howl before retreating into the shadows, disappearing into the night. The cloaked figure turned to MIA and Emma, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Get up," the figure said, You're not safe here. The cloaked figure stood tall and unyielding, its presence filling the clearing like a dark omen. Mia and Emma, still shaken from the Skinwalkers' terrifying attack, remained frozen, not daring to speak as the figure approached them. Their hearts pounded in their chests, the adrenaline from their desperate escape mixing with the suffocating fear that seemed to cling to the very air around them. What is that thing? Emma gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her face was pale, eyes wide with horror as she looked at the retreating figure of the Skinwalker, its eyes fading into the darkness of the trees. The cloaked figure didn't answer at first. Instead, it took a step forward, pulling back the hood, revealing a face that was older, weathered, yet oddly calm. His eyes were dark and almost unnatural, as though they had seen things no human eyes should ever have to witness. There was something ancient in his gaze, a wisdom and a burden that seemed to weigh him down. "He won't come back yet," the man said softly. "But you've crossed into his territory, and there's no turning back now." Mia and Emma exchanged glances, fear still lingering in their expressions. "Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed the surroundings, his eyes lingering on the now distant trail where the Skinwalker had retreated. The forest felt deathly still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I'm someone who knows how to survive out here," the man said finally, his voice low and steady. "My name is Joseph, and I've been fighting the Skinwalkers for longer than you can imagine." Emma took a cautious step forward. "Fighting them?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "You mean, you know what they are?" Joseph nodded. "I know what they are. They are the skin of something that once was human, twisted and turned by dark magic. A long time ago, they were just legends, stories passed down to warn people. But now they are real. They've learned to hide among us, wearing the skins of animals, sometimes even other people. They've become predators." Mia swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. We don't belong here. We need to leave. Right now." Joseph shook his head slowly. "It's not that simple. You think you're safe, but you're not. The Skinwalker is hunting you. He's marked you." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mia and Emma looked at each other, their fear deepening. What Joseph said was true. They had both felt it, the growing sense of being watched, of being pursued. They had no idea what had truly happened to Jake, but now they knew that whatever was hunting them wasn't a mere coincidence. It was something deliberate. Joseph continued, his voice low. "The Skinwalker knows your fear, knows your weakness. He won't stop until he's claimed you. He's already marked Tyler, and soon, he'll come for you too." What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice cracking. Joseph's eyes softened, but only slightly. "We fight. There's only one way to defeat them, to break their hold. But it's dangerous, and it requires a sacrifice." The firelight flickered in the small camp Joseph had set up nearby. He had insisted they stay close to him for the night. "The Skinwalker won't leave until he's exhausted all options," he had said. "And he doesn't tire easily." The trio sat around the fire, their nerves frayed as they listened to Joseph explain the steps they would need to take to survive the night. Skinwalkers feed off fear, but they also feed off confusion. "They want to turn you against each other," Joseph said. "They'll mimic your voices, look like your loved ones, and slowly, they'll break you down until they can take you. But there is one way to stop them." Mia leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What's the way?" Joseph didn't immediately answer. Instead, he rummaged through his pack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a bundle of dried herbs and a weathered book. "We have to destroy the Skinwalker's skin," he said, his voice grim. "It's the only way to sever their connection to the world. But it's not simple. The Skinwalker will fight to keep his skin, and he'll stop at nothing to protect it. The only way to do it is through fire." Mia's stomach churned. She had seen the way the Skinwalker moved, the way it shifted between man and beast. The idea of facing it again filled her with terror. But there was no choice. They had to do something. Joseph looked at them both, his eyes hardening with resolve. You need to burn the skin, his true skin, the one he hides beneath. And to do that, you'll have to get close. You'll have to face the creature at its most vulnerable. How do we even find it? Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Joseph smiled, but it was not a comforting smile. It's already found you. That night, as they huddled in the camp, the sounds of the forest shifted. The wind that had been so still earlier began to pick up, howling through the trees with a sudden ferocity. The fire flickered violently, casting strange, dancing shadows against the rocks. Mia's nerves were on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was approaching, something far more terrible than the creature they had already encountered. Suddenly, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She heard something, soft, almost imperceptible. Whispers carried on the wind. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the voices grew louder, their tones mocking and low. They were speaking in her voice. MIA, MIA, the voices taunted. Come out, come out. Her eyes shot to the trees, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move within them. Something tall and dark, moving slowly but with purpose. It's him, Joseph said quietly, his eyes never leaving the shadows. The Skinwalker is here. The fire died down to a weak, sputtering glow as the shadows seemed to grow thicker around them. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the dark figure emerging from the trees. She could hear it now, the rustling of leaves, the slow, deliberate footfalls drawing nearer. Then, as the figure stepped closer into the firelight, it stopped. And Mia's blood ran cold as she saw its face, her own face, twisted into a grotesque smile. You shouldn't have come here, the Skinwalker whispered in Mia's voice, stepping forward with unnerving grace. Mia's heart hammered in her chest, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. There, standing in the firelight, was the creature. The figure before her had the same face, the same features, but they were twisted, distorted, unnatural. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, empty yet piercing, as though it could see into her very soul. Its smile widened, stretching too far, too unnaturally, and Mia's blood ran cold. It was her, but it wasn't. The creature tilted its head to the side, its expression mocking. Come closer, it hissed, its voice a sickening mix of Mia's own tone and something darker, something ancient and evil. I've been waiting for you. The words sent a shiver down Mia's spine, and she instinctively stepped back. Emma, her face pale with terror, stood frozen beside her, too shocked to move. Tyler, who had been silent, clenched his fists as if preparing to fight, but Joseph's hand shot out to stop him. Don't engage, Joseph whispered, his voice sharp. The Skinwalker can mimic your voice, your appearance, but it's not you. Don't let it trick you. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her as the creature, her own reflection, took a slow step forward. It's just a game, it said, its voice low and throaty, full of venom. And you're the prey. The creature's hands were like claws now, elongated and jagged, and it reached for MIA, its fingers twitching with hunger. The moonlight reflected off its gnarled nails, and Mia's mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. Stay still, Joseph ordered quietly. The ritual only works if you stand your ground. MIA fought the urge to flee, her pulse racing as the creature's distorted grin widened. Its body swayed slightly, as if toying with her. The air felt thick, heavy, suffocating. She could hear the soft wind picking up again, but it sounded like distant whispers, like a chorus of voices, all calling her name. MIA, MIA, the voices echoed in the trees, in the air around her, each whisper sending a jolt of terror through her veins. Come to me. Come back to where you belong. MIA clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. She wasn't MIA anymore. This was something else. Something that had taken everything from her and twisted it into a nightmare. She couldn't let it win. The figure took another step closer, its voice now a low growl as it repeated her name. Each syllable sent a sickening thrill through Mia's body. Her mind reeled. She had to resist. She had to hold her ground. But the power of its mimicry was so strong. It spoke her name again. But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was loud, clear, full of malice. The voice echoed all around her, drowning out her thoughts. MIA. MIA. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens. Dozens of voices mimicking her own, sounding desperate, pleading, each one louder than the last. Her head throbbed, and she staggered, her vision blurring as if the world around her was warping. Tyler tried to move toward her, but Joseph held him back with a firm grip, his face etched with concern. "You have to keep your mind clear," Joseph instructed. "Don't let it pull you in. It feeds off your fear." But MIA could feel herself slipping. The creature's face, it wasn't just her face anymore. It was shifting, changing, blending her face with another. Her mother's face, her best friend's face, and worse still, the faces of the people who had once crossed her. Faces she thought she had buried long ago. "Why did you leave me, MOA?" The creature whispered in her mother's voice, stepping closer. "You abandoned me too. You abandoned us all." MIA gasped, her eyes wide in shock. The creature's voice took on yet another form. It was Tyler now, taunting her, mocking her in his voice. "You'll never escape. We'll all find you." The words stung like sharp needles to her heart. She could feel herself unraveling, piece by piece, as the Skinwalkers' shifting forms continued their assault. The fear and the confusion it caused were overwhelming, and she felt like she was drowning in it. Emma screamed, her voice cutting through the maddening voices in Mia's head. "MIA, don't listen to it. It's lying." Suddenly, the creature's shape shifted once again, its features rippling in a grotesque display of unnatural fluidity. Mia's vision blurred, and she heard a faint buzzing noise, like the distant hum of an electric current. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, trying to remember Joseph's words. The creature loomed over her, its form growing larger with every passing second. Its eyes blazed with hunger, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. MIA could barely hear the screams of her friends as the creature's presence overwhelmed her senses. Then, through the chaos of voices, she heard Joseph's command, loud and clear, "Now." In an instant, Mia's mind cleared. The Skinwalker's grip on her wavered. She turned quickly, grabbing the small pouch of herbs Joseph had handed her earlier, the herbs she had been instructed to use. The firelight flickered again, as if responding to her determination. She opened the pouch and threw the herbs onto the fire, watching as they burst into an unnatural, greenish flame that flared and hissed like a live thing. The fire grew hotter, brighter, and the air around them seemed to crackle with power. "No!" The creature screamed, its voice now full of fear. Its skin began to burn, smoke rising from the areas where the fire touched it. The shapeshifter recoiled, its form warping and screeching in agony. The forest shook, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble with a violent force. But MIA held her ground, focusing every ounce of strength and willpower on the ritual. The flames grew higher, engulfing the Skinwalker's form, and as the fire reached its peak, the creature howled in pain, its form disintegrating into ash and smoke, scattering into the wind. For a moment, the forest fell silent. The unnatural sounds faded, the air cleared, and the moonlight seemed brighter than before. MIA felt a strange sense of peace, but it was short-lived. Just as she thought they had one, Emma screamed from behind her. MIA whipped around to see Emma, her eyes wide with horror, staring into the trees. "MIA, it's still out there. Something's coming." A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Mia's blood ran cold. She knew, deep down, that this was far from over. The Skinwalker had been defeated, but its curse had not been fully broken. The darkness that had once consumed the creature had now turned its focus on them. Something far worse was on the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of burning herbs, their acrid scent lingering in the breeze as the last remnants of the Skinwalkers' form dissolved into the smoke. MIA and Emma stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fading firelight. The growl from the trees was unmistakable, and the hairs on the back of Mia's neck stood up as she felt a new presence. The same presence that had stalked them for days, but this time it was different. It was angrier, stronger. Joseph, too, had heard the growl. His face darkened as he turned to MIA and Emma, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The fear he had kept hidden behind his calm demeanor was now evident. "We've only weakened it," he said, his voice steady but tense. "The Skinwalker isn't done with you. It's using the shadows to regain its power." The fire flickered in the soft wind, casting long, dancing shadows over the ground. But the shadows seemed to move with purpose, shifting and elongating in ways that couldn't be explained by the fire alone. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away slowly. She could feel it. The creature was there, lurking just beyond the light, watching them. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice a mix of panic and exhaustion. Joseph didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted to the trees, and then back to MIA. He motioned toward the east. "We need to move," he said. "We're not safe here. Not for long." The chase. They wasted no time. Joseph led the way, guiding them through the trees with a purpose, his every step deliberate, as though he knew exactly where he was going. But MIA couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't escaping. Not really. The air had grown heavier, the shadows darker, and every time they glanced back, the forest seemed to stretch, closing in on them. The sound of something moving through the underbrush, too fast, too deliberate, made Mia's pulse spike. She glanced behind her, just in time to see a figure dart between the trees. The figure was human-like but distorted, its form flickering in the shadows. It was moving faster now, its shape shifting as it closed in. "It's following us," Emma gasped, her breath coming in shallow bursts as they pushed forward. "It's right behind us." Joseph looked back, his eyes narrowing. "It won't stop. We need to get to the old ruin. It's the only place I can make a stand." The distant howling of the creature grew louder, like a warning. It wasn't alone anymore. There were more of them, more than one. The forest had become a labyrinth of eyes and whispers, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against them. MIA could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her, the darkness suffocating and oppressive. The branches overhead twisted and groaned, their gnarled forms clawing at the air. The howling grew louder still, until it was more than just sound. It was inside her head, a maddening cacophony that threatened to tear her apart. She turned to Joseph. "The ruins. Where are they?" "Not much further," he said, his voice tight. "Stay close." The ruins. After what felt like an eternity of running through the forest, they reached a small clearing where the remnants of an ancient stone structure lay, half buried by the desert sands. The ruins were weathered by time, their walls cracked and crumbling, but there was a stillness here, an eerie silence that seemed to wrap around them like a cocoon. Joseph led them to a stone altar in the center of the ruins. It was cracked and worn, but MIA could feel the power emanating from it. She had no idea what kind of ritual he planned to perform, but she knew that if it could keep them safe from the creatures closing in on them, it was their only hope. "We can't stay here long," Joseph muttered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "They'll be here soon." MIA turned her head sharply as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. They were surrounded. The Skinwalkers had encircled them. The first one emerged from the shadows. Its shape was distorted, its limbs too long and jagged, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed in the darkness, burning with a predatory hunger. The second one followed, and then the third. MIA and Emma backed up against the stone altar, terror gripping their hearts. "What are we supposed to do now?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Joseph took a deep breath, then began chanting something in a language MIA didn't recognize. His words were sharp, rhythmic, as though they carried an ancient power. The Skinwalkers hissed, their forms shifting between man and beast, but they didn't attack. They seemed to be waiting, watching. Joseph's chant grew louder, more urgent. The ground beneath them trembled, and the ruins seemed to come alive, the stones glowing faintly in the darkness. MIA could feel the air crackling with energy, a palpable tension building as Joseph's words reached their climax. Then, with a forceful cry, Joseph thrust his arms outward, and the altar erupted in light. The light blasted outward, searing the air and forcing the Skinwalkers back. Their howls filled the air as they shrieked in fury, retreating into the darkness. But even as the light pulsed, MIA could feel a chilling presence looming, watching them from the trees. The fire in the ruins flickered out, and the shadows grew once more. "It's not over," Joseph said, his voice low, his eyes wide with dread. "It never is." Suddenly, from the darkness, the howl of the Skinwalker sounded again, louder, closer, and more furious than before. MIA turned to see something, or someone, standing just beyond the ruins. A dark silhouette emerged from the trees, too large, too imposing to be human. The figure stepped forward, and in that moment, MIA realized it wasn't one of the Skinwalkers. It was him. The Skinwalker was back, but this time, it was far worse than anything they had faced before. His eyes glowed brighter, his mouth curled into a grotesque grin. It wasn't the Skinwalker they had battled earlier. No, this one was different, and it was coming for them.